Manish, yeah, done. We can go now. Manish, kindly give the cue.
Five, four, three, two, one. Please start, ma'am.
A very good evening to everyone. I'm Dr. Pallavi Raj. I am a glaucoma consultant in Shankar Netralaya, Kolkata. I warmly welcome all of you to this Ophtha Eva webinar, Surfing the Glaucoma Wave. Now, as far as Ophtha Eva is concerned, it is a group of the Evas of ophthalmology where we firmly believe in sharing our knowledge and experience with the sole motto of growing together and also to practice the highest standards in regularly conduct webinars in all streams to benefit all the EFAs in different specialities. So first of all, I would like to welcome Dr. Chandrima Paul. Dr. Chandrima Paul, ma'am, needs no introduction. She is the director of BBI Hospitals and the Honorary General Secretary of the Glaucoma Society of India. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am, and I would request you to speak a few words.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pallavi, and thank you very much all the Ophtha Evas, very particularly Dr. Swati Agarwal for having me here. It's indeed a pleasure to be here with you all this evening, and I think you can start on with the proceedings. Thank you very much once again.
So next we have the panelist, which is Dr. Suchanda Sar, ma'am, a senior consultant in the glaucoma department of Disha Eye Hospital. Then we have Dr. Maitri Das also with us in the panel. She is also a director of Eye Research Foundation. We have Dr. Manish Singh with us, Director Netralayam. He's also the Joint Secretary of GSI. And Dr. Kumar Ravi, who's a senior consultant in Netralayam. Further, we have the national EVAs, which is Dr. Sunita Dubey. I warmly welcome you, ma'am, and also Dr. Sahinur from Guwahati. A very warm welcome to all of you. And now I should talk about our moderator for evening, Dr. Swati Agarwal. She is the Director and Chief Consultant, the Eye Clinic, Kolkata. She specializes in phaco-refractive glaucoma, medical retina, and LASIK services. She is the recipient of the prestigious Anutosh Datta Memorial Award 2009. She has several presentations, articles, publications to her credit. She is a vivid speaker at various state and national forums. She has been in the organizing teams for various state and national level conferences. So with this, I pass on to Dr. Swati Agarwal for further proceedings.
Thank you so much, Pallavi, for the introduction. But really, I'm honored to moderate this session with the stalwarts of glaucoma, Dr. Chandrima ma'am, and Dr. Maitri ma'am, Dr. Sunita Dubey, Dr. Shahinur, Dr. Shuchanda sir, Dr. Mani Singh, Dr. Pallavi herself, like you name it and they are there. So let us proceed with the session. So our first talk for the evening is by Dr. Sunita Dubey. I'll just So Dr. Sunita ma'am, she's a glaucoma, she's done a glaucoma fellowship at the Wills Eye Hospital in Philadelphia and has performed more than 25,000 surgeries. She's one of the first to start the MIGS in India. And we all know her to be a very smiling madam who has received multiple awards and always eager to share her knowledge with all the juniors. Welcome, ma'am, and please, can we benefit from your talk now?
Thank you, Swati. Can I share my screen? Should I share my screen?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, sure. Can you see my slides?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So at the outset, I would like to thank Avtha for this invitation and for this opportunity. And I'll be speaking on practical pearls in NTG. As we know, normal tension glaucoma is a multifactorial disease, and normal tension glaucoma and POAG represent a continuum of open angle glaucomas. While intraocular pressure is a predominant causative factor in POAG, additional IOP independent factors, especially the vascular factors, are said to have a prominent role in causation of NTG. However, one should remember that NTG is a diagnosis of exclusion, and it's important to rule out POAG, especially the wide fluctuation of intraocular pressure, the diurnal variations, and non-glaucomatous causes of optic nerve cupping before ruling in normal tension glaucoma. Now, NTG accounts for a significant percentage of all forms of open angle glaucoma, especially in Asia. And in Japanese population, it is specifically very highly prevalent compared to POAG. And the prevalence is 92% of POAG patients had IOP of less than 21 millimeter mercury, according to one study. And even in Baltimore eye study, almost 60% of the patients had IOP of less than 21 millimeter mercury on presentation. So it's pretty common to have low IOP on presentation. The clinical characteristics remain almost similar as POAG. However, there are subtle differences in clinical characteristics of normal tension glaucoma, which we do see clinically also. So most of the glaucoma NTG patients had focal rim loss, as you can see here in this picture, and associated with the focal RNFL defects, especially so in the inferotemporal quadrant. And the visual field loss is close to the fixation, and the scotomas are dense, as you can see here. There is also an increased prevalence of disc hemorrhages, which raise the possibility of the vascular pathology. Now, two forms of NTG have been described. One is non-progressive, which is associated with a transient episode of vascular shock, like sudden hypertension or loss of blood. And the progressive one, which is more common, and it's because of the chronic vascular insufficiency of the optic nerve head due to various cardiovascular and hematological abnormalities. Also, it's been seen that in normal tension glaucoma patients who present with a mean IOP in low teens, that is less than 15 millimeter mercury, there is a possibility of having different pathogenesis and progression pattern as compared to the normal tension glaucoma patients who present with higher IOP or IOP in higher teens. So let me take you through a few interesting cases where the non-IOP related mechanisms were involved. So this is a 45-year male presented to us in 2010, and he had come with a history of blurring of vision, and there was no other positive history. His vision was normal. As you can see, the pressure was normal, the angles were open, and when we examine the optic nerve, we see this changes in the optic nerve, almost 0.7 cupping with loss of superior NRR and the superior RNFL defects with corroborating findings in the visual field. So this is right eye, and this is left eye, this inferior RNFL defect with thinning of the inferior neuroretinal rim and the corroborative changes in the visual fields. So looking at the findings of the disc and fields, we did diurnal variation of pressure. The pressures were absolutely normal. In fact, they were less than 15. And we also did a 24 hours recording with the trigger fish, and there was no rise in pressure in the night as well. And the BP recordings were also normal. There was no positive history, as I said. There was no history of headache, migraine, Raynaud's phenomena, or difficulty in breathing or anything else. And the investigations were also normal. So we just started the patient on one PG analog because there were definitive changes which were suggestive of some damage to the optic nerve. And in 2 years, there were some signs of progression, as you can see here, possible progression in the right eye, whereas the left eye remained normal. There was no progression, as you can see here. So are we dealing with any vascular abnormality? Because he was a young patient, and it's been seen that in patients with normal tension glaucoma, there is high diastolic blood pressure as well as significantly greater nocturnal dip in blood pressure than healthy persons. And in patients whose disease is progressing despite normal IOP, it's important to do a 24 hours BP monitoring to look for any nocturnal dip in the blood pressure or alteration in the perfusion pressure of optic nerve head. So, and some of these patients do have ischemic episodes which are occurring, especially in the night, because of the lack of autoregulation of the circulation. So we did ambulatory blood pressure monitoring for this particular patient, and there were some spikes in the blood pressure and some dips. So we started the patient on, like we referred the patient to physician and started on the antihypertensive drugs. And he also underwent color Doppler imaging, and his end diastolic velocity was low and resistive index was high, which is suggestive of decreased ocular perfusion. So the patient has been following up with us, and you see the patient has progressed. There are some points which has deteriorated, but the progression was very, very slow. In the other eye too. And in 2019, he showed 2 points which had progressed. So it's kind of a very slow progression. Another patient who is again a young male who presented to us in 2003, and he had a history of acute blood loss in 2001. When he presented to us, his visual acuity was normal, IOP was normal, and he presented with the disc and field changes, which showed, inferior loss of rim and superior visual field defects. And the diurnal variation of intraocular pressure was normal, BP was normal. So since he had a history of acute blood loss, we thought it could be just one-time event, and it could be a non-progressive type of glaucoma. And we started the patient on 1 PG analog because there was definitely some changes in the disc, moderate changes in the disc and fields. But as you can see here, from 2003 to 2019 and 2020, now the patient had come in 2020 also, the progression was very less. It is just 1.7% per year. Similarly in the left eye also, but there are some changes in the event analysis, few points which showed progression. So again, this patient had some progression, but the progression was very slow. The third case, again a young male, 48-year-old. He was an obese person, and there was no history of hypertension or diabetes. He was taking treatment for depression. And as you can see here, there are some changes in his disc with RNFL loss in the right eye, inferior temporal, and in the left eye, there was not much loss of rim. And there were corroborative changes in the OCT and fields, as you can see here. And despite the pressure being normal, this patient showed some signs of progression on visual fields in both eyes. And this is his recording of intraocular pressure at various time period. So he did give the history of disturbed sleep cycles, snoring, excessive daytime sleepiness, fatigue. So are we dealing with obstructive sleep apnea? So he was advised polysomnography. So these were 3 patients which had a history of some non-IOP related findings, and they were suggestive of normal tension glaucoma. So normal tension glaucoma, if you talk about the risk factors, as we know, IOP is a major risk factor. Female sex, myopia, thin CCT, and East Asian ethnicity again are the risk factors for normal tension glaucoma. And there is definite vascular pathology in some of these patients, which includes diabetes, hypertension, hypotension, migraine, sleep apnea, low ocular perfusion pressure, etc. Flemmer has described a condition called primary vascular dysfunction, and these patients, the findings include cold extremities, low blood pressure, decreased thirst, and tinnitus. So these patients are more prone to have normal tension glaucoma. So etiology of normal tension glaucoma is multifactorial, as I said, and nocturnal hypotension, autonomic dysfunction, intracranial pressure, and obstructive sleep apnea are the major risk factors. And different studies suggest that the diastolic perfusion pressure, if it is less than 30, had significant risk of development of glaucoma. And patients having low systolic ocular perfusion pressure also show an almost 50% higher risk of progression. So low ocular perfusion pressure is a risk factor. Autonomic dysregulation, we hear a lot about autonomic dysregulation and conditions which can cause it. Conditions which can cause vasospasm like migraine, systemic hypertension, atherosclerosis, Raynaud phenomena, or endothelial dysfunctions associated with hyperlipidemia, atherosclerosis, and hyperglycemia. And I just described the Flammer syndrome. So basically all these conditions can lead to chronic imbalance of sympathetic and parasympathetic system, leading to decreased ocular perfusion pressure, and these patients are predisposed to normal tension glaucoma. Intracranial pressure again is a risk factor because optic nerve is not only exposed to IOP but also to intracranial pressure through cerebral fluid, CSF. And CSF pressure is lower in glaucoma, specifically in normal tension glaucoma. So there is a high translaminar pressure differential which could exert stress on the lamina cribrosa and ganglion cell loss, leading to the optic nerve damage. So again, I think this has come out to be an important risk factor. Obstructive sleep apnea and glaucoma, there are several studies now which show that there is some correlation between the obstructive sleep apnea and glaucoma. And OSA is characterized by recurrent, complete, or partial interruption of normal breathing due to functional occlusion or collapse of upper respiratory airway during sleep, and which leads to decrease in arterial oxygen saturation and increase in carbon dioxide during sleep, and reduction in ocular perfusion pressure, leading to decreased oxygenation of optic nerve head and glaucomatous optic neuropathy. So these patients typically present with habitual loud snoring at night. So their family members can give you this history of snoring and nocturnal gasping if it is very severe. And in the daytime, they may show lack of energy, reduced concentration, dry throat, and morning headaches. And diagnosis is done by overnight polysomnography and apnea-hyperapnea index per hour. And the gold standard technique for treating OSA is CPAP. So one must ask history of sleep apnea, especially in patients who are obese and who show glaucomatous changes with normal pressures. Now coming to diagnosis. So diagnosis, as I said, is the diagnosis of exclusion. You need to rule out large fluctuations of intraocular pressure because whatever you're measuring in the clinic is just a snapshot, and pressure may be high during night or early morning, which we usually do not measure. CCT, if before diagnosing patient has normal tension glaucoma, it is mandatory to do the corneal central corneal thickness. Gonioscopy is a must because you can miss subtle primary angle closure glaucoma or subtle signs of pseudoexfoliation in pigmentary glaucomas, because we know that pigmentary glaucomas, the pigment release decreases as the age advances, and the changes of glaucomatous glaucoma may be seen. So you need to rule out all these conditions, and detailed history has to be taken regarding migraine, Raynaud's phenomena, episodes of shock, headache, sleep apnea, cardiovascular abnormalities, hypertension, diabetes, and neurological symptoms. So all these conditions one should keep in mind while dealing with the patients with normal tension glaucoma. One should also ask history of excessive water drinking in morning, because in India, it's quite common to take 3-4 glasses of water in the morning, as it is good for health, and yoga exercises, especially the breath holding exercises, and use of medications, especially steroids. I think it's very important to know about the usage of steroids, and if the patient is having some kind of allergies, systemic allergies also, or asthma, or some skin allergy. Some of these patients do take steroids and beta blockers. So 24 hours blood pressure monitoring is essential to exclude nocturnal systemic hypotension and BP spikes. And blood investigations should be done to rule out systemic etiology. MRI is not indicated in all patients, but it may be necessary to rule out if you're suspecting intracranial space occupying lesions. And the indications include young patients who show signs of neurological field defects, where the field defects respect vertical meridian. If there's rim pallor is more than cupping, new onset or increased severity of headaches, or some color vision abnormality. So MRI is not indicated in all patients of normal tension glaucoma, but you need to do it in some patients, especially the young patients. Now coming to management. IOP reduction is the mainstay of treatment in normal tension glaucoma also, and collaborative normal tension treatment study showed that a 30% reduction favorably influenced the progression of the disease as compared to untreated normal tension glaucoma controls. And in normal tension glaucoma also, PG analogs is the first choice of drug, and brimonidine and dorzolamide, the drugs which are considered to be neuroprotective and vasoprotective, can be considered as an adjuvant therapy if the IOP is not controlled, and surgery can be considered when the target IOP is not maintained or the patient is progressing despite the target IOP being maintained. However, one needs to be very careful about the prevention of hypotony, because the IOP is low in these patients, and the glaucoma filtration surgery, especially the trabeculectomy, can lead to hypotony. So releasable sutures and are indicated in patients with normal tension glaucoma. The role of calcium channel blockers and neuro regenerative diseases, neuroregenerative agents is not very well documented. However, one very important and additional aspect of treatment of normal tension glaucoma is to treat any cardiovascular abnormalities, including hypertension, anemia, transient ischemic attacks. As I said, these patients may be having more transient ischemic attacks, especially during night, or cardiac arrhythmias, and to ensure maximal perfusion of optic nerve head, especially during night. So to conclude, controlling the intraocular pressure remains the mainstay of management of normal tension glaucoma, as in primary angle, open angle glaucoma. However, consideration must be given to vascular factors. And as I mentioned, the systemic history, detailed history about the systemic diseases should be asked, and more so in patients who are progressing despite normal intraocular pressure. And most importantly, if patient is having some kind of systemic disease, the treatment of systemic disease is required. Neuroprotective agents can theoretically improve the function of retinal ganglion cells and optic nerve, and thus interesting area of investigations, and a lot of investigations are going on to ascertain their role for the management of normal tension glaucoma. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a very detailed presentation and very knowledgeable. Okay, ma'am, do you have you prescribed salt ampules for patients with low blood pressure?
Salt ampules?
Yes, ma'am. If a person
Actually,
has
what we do is like we as an ophthalmologist do not prescribe anything, but we do refer the patient to physician for a complete checkup, cardiovascular checkup. So I think it's very important for a complete cardiovascular checkup of these patients and monitoring of blood pressure, ambulatory blood pressure, 24 hours blood pressure, to know about the nocturnal dip or the spikes of blood pressure. So if there is any, because sometimes patients do not give any history of blood pressure, hypertension, but when you do this ambulatory BP recording, there are some spikes of the BP which are seen. So it's better to refer these patients to the physicians or cardiologists if there is any signs.
Okay. Suchanda ma'am, what is your take on this? What is your way of dealing with this kind of these patients? Ma'am, you need to unmute yourself.
I think after what Dr. Dubey has spoken, there is nothing else left to speak about. Very well presented, Dr. Dubey. It is definitely a diagnosis by exclusion, and the way it has been done with a 24-hour IOP monitoring, ambulatory BP, and doing obstruct polysomnography. Unfortunately, I don't have access to a 24-hour diurnal system, but that is the way to go. After her presentation and take-home conclusion, I think and a case of NTG should ideally be diagnosed only after all these tests have been done. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Ravi, would you like to add something?
All point. My way would be like reverse, like what Madam has told, it's excellent, everything covered. But let us go the reverse way. Suppose a case is diagnosed as NTG wrongly, and suppose a disc is, there is something in the disc, maybe pallor or something which we missed, and we diagnose the case as NTG. Now what happens is this patient is diagnosed as normal rotation glaucoma. He has a perimetry which will show some particular field effect. If the pressure was say 18 or 20 at presentation, we'll give him one drop. The pressure will come down to 14 or 15. We will be happy, patient will be happy that, okay, the pressure has come down. Next 10 years, the HVF will be normal. Every time it will be same, non-progressing. But what we have done is, we have probably misdiagnosed the case as NTG. Okay, so the diagnosis is very, very important. Otherwise, we are putting the patient through medication effects and misdiagnosis of glaucoma for entire life, when it was just a case of pale disc or maybe a neurological condition which is non-progressive. I have happened to have seen cases like this, reversed it and stopped the treatment. But then, why to make such a diagnosis?
Actually, I have also seen the patients with normal tension glaucoma are very slow progressors. Patients will progress fast only when the IOP is high. As I had in both of my patients, the follow-up is almost now 20 years. One patient presented in 2003, now 2021. So in 20 has just progressed with the rate of 1.7% VFI. So that line, the GPA index, it is almost a straight line. So I think one needs to be very, very careful, and one need not be very aggressive in treating these patients unless you document progression. That is what I wanted to convey, that most of the normal tension glaucoma patients, the progression is very slow. So you can just examine the patient systemically. If there is any systemic disease, treat the systemic disease, and unnecessarily don't keep on adding eye drops one after the other.
Okay. Dr. Manish, would you like to say something about this?
I think, Swati, we have covered most of these points. Madam has discussed in detail. One important thing I just want to add, as we have already discussed, that it's a diagnosis of exclusion. So actually making a diagnosis of normal tension glaucoma needs a detailed evaluation of multiple factors. A lot of time, sometimes you may miss a history of steroid, or there is a burnt out pigmentary glaucoma. So a lot of things needs to be first excluded. So in a way, actually diagnosing normal tension glaucoma probably is more difficult than diagnosing other glaucoma, because you need to exclude multiple things. And most of us don't have the facility to do 24-hour diurnal IOP. So actually, for us, actually diagnosing a normal tensile glaucoma is really difficult. So I think it's a really diagnosis of exclusion. We should look into other factors, and the treatment part, madam has already discussed in detail.
Okay, thank you.
Swati, can I just add?
Yes, ma'am. Please sum up the stock for us.
It's a wonderful talk, Sunita, as usual. The thing is that normotensive glaucoma really needs to be evaluated because it actually could be a pointer for a systemic disease. Many a time I have found that evaluating normotensive glaucoma, actually we've discovered that the patient has a systemic disease, which is more serious maybe because as she mentioned that, normotensive glaucoma progresses very slowly. So more than the glaucoma progressing, it's the systemic disease, which it is a pointer to, for which we need treatment basically. So that is it basically.
Yes, ma'am. I think we can call that a day. Thank you, Sunita, ma'am, for the lovely talk. And thank you, panelist and chairperson. Now our next talk for the evening is by Dr. Supriya Singh. I'd like to introduce her first. Dr. Supriya has done her PG from Bangalore, and she's a glaucoma fellow from SN. And let's hear from her about IOP or not an IOP. Dr. Supriya. Dr. Supriya, please unmute yourself and restart, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks to Ophtha Eva Group, especially Dr. Tulika, for giving me this opportunity. Now, today's case is about a 79-year-old gentleman, a civil engineer by profession, who came to us in June 2016 for an opinion. He had Hansen's disease and had repeated attacks of uveitis in both eyes in late 90s. The last episode of uveitis was in March 2005. His baseline intraocular pressure in right eye was 28 millimeters of mercury, while in left eye it was 32 millimeters of mercury. He underwent combined procedure, that is cataract extraction along with filtering surgery in right eye and left eye in 2002 and 2003 respectively. He is a hypertensive on pacemaker, and at the time of presentation he was on AC inhibitor telmisartan 40 milligram, which he used to take in the morning. His father had glaucoma. Now, when he came to us, he was using travoprost, brinzolamide, and a combination of brimonidine and timolol eye drops in both the eyes. His best corrected visual acuity in right eye was 6 by 6 N6, while in left eye it was 6 by 24 part N6. The intraocular pressure in right eye was 12 millimeters, while in left eye it was 14 millimeters. These are his anterior segment photographs. Both the eyes had flat bleb with quite anterior chamber. There is optic capture of intraocular lens in right eye, while in left eye IOL is well placed in the back. 180 degrees of angles were closed due to PAS in right eye, while in another 180 degrees there were scattered PAS, while in left eye there was total occlusion of angles due to peripheral anterior synity. The pachymetry in right eye was 531 microns, while in left eye it was 512 microns. These are his optic disc photographs. So right eye had near total cupping with just a small superior nasal rim remaining, while in left eye there was almost total cupping of the optic nerve head. So clinically left eye was much more worse than the right eye. We asked for visual fields, and right eye he had advanced damage, but there was no split fixation. And since he had a low foveal threshold and advanced damage, therefore a size 5 stimulus with the macular threshold was used for the left eye. Now, these fields were compared with his previous reports, and his glaucoma was found to be stable. So I asked him to continue with the same topical anti-glaucoma medications and advised to come for follow-up every 2 to 3 months. Now, this patient was very much compliant for his follow-ups and treatment. Then he came In October 2017, I noticed a fresh disc hemorrhage in the superior temporal quadrant in the right eye, while the left eye was stable. Now, as we know, disc hemorrhage is an important risk factor for the progression of glaucoma. So visual fields were repeated. As you can see here, these are his previous field reports of 2015 and then May of 2017, which are stable. And when we repeated the fields in October 2017, there was definite progression. The fields were repeated once again after 15 days, and these findings were reconfirmed. Left eye was stable as usual. The intraocular pressure on that particular day was 11 millimeters in right eye and 13 millimeters in left eye. So I thought of doing a diurnal variability testing to check for any IOP peak happening at any point of time. Now, since mine is a daycare facility, so it is not practically possible to check for intraocular pressures during the night time. So patient was called in the morning, and from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. every 2 hours, 5 consecutive intraocular pressure readings were obtained in right eye and left eye. The IOP in right eye ranged from 10 millimeters to 13 millimeters, and in left eye it ranged from 11 to 14 millimeters. I was expecting for at least one peak, but there was none. So here I had a patient who initially presented with secondary angle closure glaucoma and was now behaving like a normal tension glaucoma. Then I looked for other risk factors. There was no history of migraine, Raynaud's phenomenon, sleep apnea, but yes, he was on pacemaker and he is a hypertensive. The role of systemic hypertension is very much controversial, with few studies supporting while most of the studies refuting its association. So I thought of checking his previous blood pressure recordings. I could just find one recording on first day of presentation. The rest of the readings were missing as I had not bothered to check for his BP in between. And this is the reading on the day when he presented with disc hemorrhage. Still, I had my suspicions and I asked him to check his blood pressure recording done in night time, at least for 10 consecutive days, and come back with the report. So the patient went to a local pharmacist, and for next 10 consecutive days, his blood pressure was checked at around 10 o'clock in the night. And what I noticed was there was a significant dipping of diastolic blood pressure, less than 60 millimeters mercury at majority of times. So then I asked him to go for a 24 hours ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. And we got similar results in that ABP monitoring. Just after midnight and from 10:30 a.m. to 11 o'clock in the morning, the diastolic BP was dipping down to as low as 40 millimeters of mercury. I calculated his ocular perfusion pressure and it was found to be less than 50 millimeters. And when I checked for his nocturnal hypotension, he was found to be a dipper. So most probably a low ocular perfusion pressure and nocturnal hypotension were the culprits for glaucoma progression in this particular patient. Now, initially to start with, he was taking ACE inhibitors in the morning time, but in between the cardiologist has added calcium channel blockers at night time to prevent early morning surge. And this happened in August 2017 while he came to us in October 2017 with a disc hemorrhage. With regard to this, there is a very interesting study which got published in Journal of Ophthalmology in 2018. The data for that study was taken from medical insurance database, and patients' prescriptions were analyzed, and they found that calcium channel blockers are strongly associated with an increased incidence of primary open-angle glaucoma, while selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and beta blockers offer a protective role in glaucoma. Now, it is very difficult to say how much relevant this calcium channel blocker was as a drug per se in this particular case, but definitely an additional antihypertensive effect of a second medication compounded nocturnal hypotension. So I requested a cardiologist and he changed his medications. The calcium channel blocker was taken out and the dosage of ACE inhibitor was increased. Presently, his glaucoma is stable. So the lesson which I learned from this case was vascular factors do play a role not only in case of normal tension glaucoma and primary open angle glaucoma, but they might have a role in other types of glaucoma also. So it is always better to get at least 124 hours ambulatory blood pressure recording in cases of glaucoma if patient has associated cardiac comorbidity also. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Supriya. It was a lovely talk. Dr. Maitri Das, ma'am, would you like to say something about this?
Thank you, Dr. Supriya. It's a nice presentation, nice workup. Just I'd like to highlight your points only, that for all glaucoma patients' evaluations, we must ask about the blood pressure and the antihypertensive, what he is on, especially nighttime antihypertension. This is very much important for any patient, especially who are showing the progression, especially the disc hemorrhage. It's a nice workup and nicely done management. Thank you, Supriya.
Okay. Dr. Chandrima, ma'am?
Yes, Swati.
Would you
First,
like
I'd like to congratulate Dr. Supriya, because that was a really well presented case. And actually, on routine basis, you need to ask your patient whether he or she is on an antihypertensive, and if he or she is, at what time he or she is taking it. And the best thing is to have a word with the cardiologist yourself, saying that your patient has glaucoma, and so that needs to be changed. So that's a very, very important factor. Very well presented case. Yeah.
Yes, Shachanda, ma'am? Shachanda, ma'am, are you saying something? Hello, Shachanda, ma'am?
Hello.
He might have a net problem, actually.
Yeah. So does anyone wants to add anything here? Or can we move on to our next talk? Okay, I think we'll move on to our next talk. So our next talk is by Dr. Shahinoor, and so Dr. Shahinoor has done her MBBS from Bangalore and MS from Guwahati. And she's also a fellow from Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai, and is the East Zone EC member of GSI 2018-19, and has numerous presentations and posters at both state and national conferences, as well as in Melbourne. And she's also has a book chapter for the book titled Basics of Glaucoma lecture series. So let's hear from Dr. Shahinoor about angle closure disease.
So I'll start sharing my screen.
Yes, sure, please.
Yeah, there is no problem.
Yeah. A very good evening to all. I shall be talking about approach to a patient with primary angle closure disease. The characteristics of a primary angle closure disease is iridotrabecular contact, which may lead to trabecular dysfunction, peripheral anterior synechia, elevated intraocular pressure, and eventually glaucomatous optic neuropathy and blindness. The previous classification of angle closure was based on symptoms, and acute angle closure was called when there is an abrupt onset and which was not self-limiting. Subacute when the onset was abrupt, but it had a self-limiting course. And chronic when there was an elevated IOP or peripheral anterior synechia resulting from angle closure that is asymptomatic. The major flaw with this classification is that it does not indicate presence or absence of loss of visual function. It does not guide ophthalmologists with a logical management, and the term glaucoma is attached to all the subtypes despite presence or absence of optic neuropathy. Now, occludable angle is a term which is interchangeably used with a narrow angle, but they are not the same. And occludable angle has the anatomical predisposition for angle closure. However, there is no clear definition of the threshold at which angle closure is considered a diagnosis. The current diagnostic threshold is 180 to 270 degrees of iridotrabecular contact. However, evidence-based assessment has shown that this criteria is far too stringent and it could exclude many individuals who has gonioscopically narrow angles and are predisposed to appositional closure throughout the day. So the current classification of primary angle closure disease is as proposed by the International Society for Geographical and Epidemiological Ophthalmology. It identifies 3 conceptual stages according to the natural history, from iridotrabecular contact to the development of optic neuropathy, glaucomatous optic neuropathy. The primary angle closure suspect is described as having iridotrabecular contact of at least 180 to 270 degrees with normal intraocular pressure, optic nerve head and visual field. Primary angle closure or PAC with an iridotrabecular contact of at least 180 to 270 degrees with raised intraocular pressure and or peripheral anterior synechiae, but normal optic nerve head and visual field. Primary angle closure, PAC or primary angle closure with optic nerve head and or visual field changes. There is another category of patients that is the acute angle presenting with acute angle closure crisis. They have symptoms of ocular or periocular pain accompanied by headache, nausea or vomiting, and raised intraocular pressure. There is also presence of circumcorneal congestion, corneal edema, mid-dilated pupil, and shallow AC. Now coming to clinical evaluation, the most important thing in the clinical evaluation of primary angle closure disease is to detect the disease in pre-disease state before any damage has occurred. So intraocular pressure measurement is an integral part of comprehensive ophthalmological checkup, and in primary angle closure disease, the IOP may be normal or raised. Coming to slit lamp examination, the limbal anterior chamber depth or the peripheral anterior chamber depth can be assessed using the von Erichs test, where a slit beam is used to compare the peripheral anterior chamber depth to the thickness of the cornea. The sensitivity of this test is around 62%, whereas the specificity is high at 90%. It has 4 grades. In this picture, which is taken from the British Journal of Ophthalmology, the second image shows the yellow line, which is about 1/4 the thickness of the corneal thickness, that is represented by the red line. So this corresponds to grade 2 of the von Erichs test. Gonioscopy is indispensable for the diagnosis of glaucoma. It is also the gold standard for the identification of angle closure and eyes at risk for angle closure. However, the best lens for gonioscopy remains controversial. The advantage of 4-mirror lens is that it enables compression gonioscopy to differentiate closure which is due to apposition from that of synechial closure. Some of the considerations for good gonioscopy is that the cornea has to be adequately anesthetized, the room should be dimly lit, and the lowest slit lamp illumination using a narrow beam width of about 1 millimeters. The patient is asked to maintain primary gaze and care is taken to keep the light beam from illuminating the pupil. Higher magnification is used to identify the corneal wedge, which is helpful in case of faintly pigmented trabecular meshwork. Once all the 4 angles are noted, the illumination is increased and the cornea is indented using the gonio lens. Now coming to mechanism of angle closure, the angle closure could be due to one abnormality or it could be a combination of a number of abnormalities. So it is very important to know the various mechanisms because it helps to initiate appropriate treatment. The trabecular meshwork block can occur at 4 levels. Level 1 is at the iris and the pupil. A relative pressure gradient is created between the anterior and posterior chambers due to an increased iridotrabecular contact, causing aqueous to collect behind the iris and anterior bowing of the peripheral iris, leading to narrowing of the angle and acute or chronic iridotrabecular contact or angle closure glaucoma. Level 2 is at the ciliary body architecture, where an abnormal ciliary body position or development leads to angle closure. The anteriorly positioned ciliary processes force the peripheral iris into the angle and is called plateau iris. However, there is no definition as to how much narrow the angle has to be or how anteriorly positioned the ciliary processes have to be to call it a plateau iris. Level 3 is lens-induced glaucoma, where anterior subluxation of lens or intumescence can precipitate angle closure, which could be acute or chronic angle closure due to the lens directly compressing upon the structures. Level 4 is malignant glaucoma, where the forces posterior to lens pushes the iris and lens diaphragm forward. A pressure differential is created between the vitreous and aqueous compartment due to aqueous misdirection into the vitreous, and there is a very shallow chamber both at the center and at the periphery. Now coming to management of acute angle closure crisis. It is very important to diagnose a case of acute angle closure crisis based on the symptoms and signs which we have already discussed. The initial management is always medical therapy. We start anti-glaucoma medications, topical steroids to control inflammation, oral acetazolamide or oral hyperosmotic agents can be added, and if required, intravenous hyperosmotic agents like mannitol can be initiated. Once the cornea clears, laser iridotomy is done. In case the acute attack is not controlled medically, laser iridoplasty can be tried. However, trabeculectomy has a poor outcome in case of an inflamed eye. Next, management of primary angle closure and primary angle closure glaucoma. The initial treatment is using anti-glaucoma medications and laser iridotomy. The patients are again reassessed after a few weeks for control of intraocular pressure. Those on anti-glaucoma medications should be assessed for disease progression. Surgery is indicated if the IOP is not controlled, there is evidence of progression of the disease, poor compliance on the part of the patient or intolerance to medications, and also if there is coexisting cataract with a poorly controlled glaucoma. The surgical options are filtering surgery alone, lens extraction alone, or a combined lens extraction and filtering surgery. Now, lens extraction alone helps in deepening of the anterior chamber and less crowding of the angle. However, significant inflammation and transient elevation of intraocular pressure in the post-operative period can be dangerous in an eye with advanced glaucomatous optic neuropathy. Combined cataract extraction and trabeculectomy has the advantage of having both the surgeries in a single surgical sitting. Cataract removal leads to early visual rehabilitation, and trabeculectomy takes care of the IOP spikes in the post-operative period. Now, management of primary angle closure suspect. Laser peripheral iridotomy is not mandatory for all cases of primary angle closure suspect. In a study by Thomas et al., the relative risk of progression from angle closure suspect to angle closure was estimated to be 24. Some of the indications for laser PI are when the fellow eye has a diagnosis of primary angle closure or had an acute angle closure attack. If there is patchy pigmentation of the posterior trabecular meshwork, which is suggestive of prolonged iridotrabecular contact, and symptoms suggestive of intermittent closure like seeing colored halos or intermittent headache, and patients with some retinal pathology requiring repeated dilatation. There are also patients who are poor on follow-up and a family history of blindness due to angle closure glaucoma. Some pearls for laser PI is that a history of anticoagulant therapy should always be taken to avoid any hyphema, inadvertent hyphema. Argon laser has given way to Nd:ARG laser, and due to its photodisruptive nature, the overall energy required is less and does not require melanin pigment for iris absorption. However, for thick irides, sequential argon laser followed by Nd:ARG laser may be used. Next is iridoplasty, laser iridoplasty. This is usually reserved for opening an appositional angle closure despite a laser PI, as in plateau iris syndrome, and when laser PI cannot be performed, as in case of acute angle closure, which is unresponsive to medical therapy. Some pearls for performing iridoplasty is that the laser should have a larger spot size. Abraham lenses used, and it is always better to leave sufficient space of around 2 spot diameter between each spot to prevent iris necrosis. Often, the failure of iridoplasty is due to the improper placement of the laser shots, which should be in the extreme periphery. Now, specific medications for treatment of primary angle closure glaucoma. All the major classes of anti-glaucoma medications can be used to treat primary angle closure glaucoma. However, prostaglandin analogs and pilocarpine need special mention. According to the AIGS consensus, prostaglandins have been found to be effective agents for lowering IOP following iridotomy, regardless of the extent of synovial closure. Pilocarpine is an effective agent to widen narrow angles, but there is no evidence that it can prevent progression of angle closure. Hence, it should never be used in lieu of iridotomy. Besides, long-term use can lead to posterior synechia and miotic pupil, which can make cataract surgery difficult later on. So it is mainly reserved for cases with residual appositional closure, those unresponsive to other medications, and those who wish to avoid or defer surgery. ASOCT is an imaging device for the anterior chamber and angle in real time. It utilizes infrared light. However, the disadvantage is that it cannot image the ciliary body. The correlation between ASOCT and gonioscopy has not been excellent. The reason being, ASOCT measures along a single line, and different configurations are known to exist within the same quadrant, which is only picked up on gonioscopy. UBM utilizes ultrasound echoes from interfaces of tissues and fluids. The echo is optimal only when the acoustic wave is oriented perpendicular to the interface. So in order to acquire reliable images, a lot depends upon the examiner technique and experience. It is useful in imaging plateau iris configuration, iris and ciliary body cysts, etc. So to conclude, the basic terminology for angle closure has changed. We have a lot of new devices like the ASOCT and the UBM for better assessment of the angle anterior chamber, but the management remains similar what it was decades ago. So the difference that can be made is only by picking up the cases at an early stage and quality care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaheenur. That was a lovely presentation, a very detailed one indeed. And Dr. Matri, ma'am, would you like to add something?
Yeah, Dr. Shaheenur, well presented and actually covered all the talks. Only thing is the highlighting some of the points which are very important. That is the thing, the gonioscopy. That's the must for in the glaucoma clinic, whether he or she is a glaucoma practitioner or general practitioner, that is immaterial. Start doing it whenever you feel like the angle is narrow. And gonioscopy to start with You told that's a controversial which lens should be used, but I like to give a clear message. Start from the beginning, the 4-mirror. And the 4-mirror lenses, the advantages you have discussed. But the thing is, it's a very quick method. You do not need any coupling fluid. Start doing this gonioscopy in a deep anterior chamber where there is expectation of getting all the structures. It is the practice by which you can learn gonioscopy, and it is the method by which we can pick up the primary angle closure disease as a whole in time and prevent the blindness. That is a must. There is no, then another point what I like to add is, even after doing peripheral iridotomy, the disease still can progress. And it is the way, the follow-up should be very meticulous, and it should be different from that what we practice in primary open angle glaucoma. And depending on that, the stages, we can even the patient should be clearly informed that even after doing PI, the disease might progress. The disease is not been halted. So that has to be very clearly explained to the patient. And last but not the least is again, gonioscopy and gonioscopy. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Suchanda ma'am, what is your take on this?
Yeah, very good presentation, Shahinur. The only thing that Shahinur concluded that there has not been much change in management. Yes, there has been a change in management after especially the ZAP trial or the junction angle closure prevention trial, which is the largest single site study on PAC cases where they have done, I think, 890 eyes and done a 3-year follow-up where they show that YAG-PI is not mandatory in all PACS cases, which we were doing even a couple of, maybe a year ago or a couple of months ago, that all PACS needs YAG-PI. So Dr. Shahinur has mentioned what are the PACS where we need to do it. So that is one message, that all PACS do not need YAG-PI. And I would like to know whether there is any evidence-based from the other panelists and the of the chairperson and of the national panelists, whether there is any evidence-based study as to whether we need to put off anticoagulants before YAG-PI.
Sanita ma'am?
You are asking me?
Yes, ma'am. Do we need to stop anticoagulants before YAG-PI? Is the question.
I don't think.
Is there evidence-based? Yep.
No, I am not aware of any studies which suggest that you need to stop. And in the practice also, we do not stop any anticoagulants before YAG-PI. But I think one needs to be vigilant, and otherwise also, I think you should avoid blood vessels, and the message should be given if there is slightest bleeding. I think you should press the PI lens so as to stop the bleeding. But I have not seen anyone profusely bleeding during YAG-PI. So
actually, we had an experience with such a patient who progressed to full chamber hyphema, which had to be evacuated later on. So after that incident, for all patients who are on anticoagulants, we usually take a clearance from the physician, and wherever applicable, we stop it. Wherever we can stop it, we do it after stopping the anticoagulant.
No, do you check the INR after that? Is there a consensus evidence-based literature?
Yes.
I want to add one point.
Can I chip in?
Yes, sure.
There is evidence-based literature that you need to stop anticoagulant after consulting with the treating physician. And I routinely stop anticoagulant at least 3 days before I do YAG-PI. I postpone the YAG-PI if the patient is on anticoagulant. And like Shahinur said, I also managed a case done by somebody else where the AC was full of blood after the YAG-PI where an anticoagulant was on. I had to take the patient, it was referred to me by somebody. So I took the patient to the OT and cleared the anterior chamber. So, and there is evidence saying that you need to stop stop it.
No, but
And
do you check the INR, Chandrima, after stopping the anticoagulant as to whether you have achieved the INR which you should? When I'm
no,
just
we don't check that.
okay.
We don't check that. We just stop it for 3 days and do the PI and then start it after a day after the PI. That's generally what I do.
Sufficient? Is 3 days sufficient for the, like, is it
during
for the anticoagulants?
Well, we generally do it even for trabeculectomy. I stop it for 3 days and then do the surgery and then start it off after a day. That's what I've been practicing for last, well, 2 decades or so. But the PI part of it, I never used to do it before, but I started recently after that. I read that article where, they have said that you need to stop the anticoagulant. And then we had a discussion in the angle closure session of GSI as well. And we do need to stop the anticoagulant and then do a PI. Otherwise, you could actually land up into serious trouble, basically.
Okay.
And yeah, one more thing I wanted to highlight is what Shahinur said, which is very important in this COVID times for PACD, is that, I've seen a lot of patients who have been put on pilocarpine in the months of May and June last year because people were postponing iridotomies. But the message should go absolutely clear that do not postpone the iridotomy. Please do it. It does not generate any aerosol. Please do the iridotomy because, as she said, if you put a patient on pilocarpine for 6 months or a year, the patient develops a very myotic pupil, which you cannot dilate later on, and also posterior synechia as well. So please do the iridotomy. Don't keep the patient on pilocarpine.
What is the site of choice for iridotomy? Is it still the superior or where the crypts are possible, or the temporal, like?
Well, this is something we had a debate over, absolutely. Like, it was a real debate that went on about the site of thing, because initially we used to believe that the superior hemisphere is the best site because the lid would cover it and you would not get photophobia and stuff like that. Then it came that no, the middle part of the eye is the best part to do it. Then again came those posterior ciliary arteries where you might get bleeding. So basically, I feel wherever you're comfortable, wherever you see a crypt, wherever you see a little, thinness in the iris, and you think you can do it with the least number of shots, that's the place you should choose for doing PI.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Manish, you wanted to say something?
PI, one thing I would like to emphasize that in most of the angle closure glaucomas, now with the imaging technologies, we know that there are iris parameters and lens parameters, and iris is particularly thick in patients who have acute angle closure attacks. So if you're not able to do it in one go, you can just keep the patient on anti-glaucoma medications and then do it later, because if you use excessive energy, then it is going to cause problems. So I think one can repeat the PI if needed, but do not use excessive amount of energy in one go.
Can I add one point?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Actually, Dr. Suchanda was asking about the evidence-based thing about stopping the anticoagulants. So I'm not aware of that thing, but for a long time, say more than 10 years back, I had a case, very bad case, what they were also sharing. It was, patient was on anticoagulant, I did the PI and there was a hyphema and I was not able to stop it with all kinds of things. And then after taking the history, then I realized that I did not stop it. I stopped the anticoagulants 1 week before the procedure, both for the operations as well as for the PI, and start it 3 days after the thing. And I think it can also be a medical legal issue also if you're not taking the history and doing this thing, because it is a blind procedure. You can injure the vessels and can start this kind of bleeding. It's an accidental hemorrhage. So medical issue also, you have to, medical legal aspect also have to keep it in mind.
Okay, and yes, Dr. Manish, you were trying, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, actually, related to this iridotomy, actually the problem is a lot of our patients are on warfarin or even heparin. So these patients, maybe 3 days or 4 days may not be enough. So I remember around maybe a decade back, there was some medical legal case in Indore where the patient had a iridotomy and patient had a hyphema, and there was a case against the ophthalmologist. So I'm not aware of any EGS or AO guideline where it is very clearly mentioned to stop anti-glaucoma medication, sorry, anti blood thinners. But what we have been doing of late is that we check the PTINR, and if the PTINR is normal, we straight away go ahead with the PI. If the patient is on anticoagulants, and if the PTINR is disturbed, we take the permission of the cardiologist and then we stop it. Because a lot of these patients with stent or with CABG, the cardiologist may not be comfortable stopping the anticoagulants. So PTINR is something I'm doing routinely. And one more thing, I think we were discussing about the UBM. We do get a lot of patients who are referred for UBM or ASOCT to decide about whether iridotomy should be done or not. The problem is that UBM, when you're doing, you're actually doing in a supine position. So we are not actually getting the correct architecture of the angle, plus the room lights are on. So whether to decide on doing an iridotomy or not should always be based on a gonioscopy and not based on a UBM and ASOCT.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes.
UBM we are doing only when after iridotomy, the angle doesn't open up, just to see whether it's plateau iris or some iris cyst behind the iris or ciliary body cyst.
Exactly.
Really, I don't think anyone is doing UBM to decide.
No, ma'am.
Correct.
No, ma'am. We are not doing, but we actually we do get a lot of patients who are referred for UBM to decide for that what I was sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. So message should be clear that UBM is not decide whether iridotomy should be done or not. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And what about does anyone practice extraction of lens for supposedly narrow angles? Is anyone doing that? In hypermetropic?
We are not doing, but the threshold for lens extraction is lower. So if the patient is having cataract and even slightest of cataract, then I think it's a good idea. Especially if what we do is we do ASOCT also, and if there's higher lens vault, because we have seen almost, I think, in patients, just pure pupillary block is there in 55 to 60% of the patients, pure non-pupillary block in 8% of patients. So most of the patients, like 92% of the patients, have both pupillary and non-pupillary block mechanisms. So PI is required almost every case of PAC and PACG. I'm not talking about PCS. So PAC and PACG, and once you have done iridotomy, and if the angle doesn't open up, and if you see increased lens vault, which you can diagnose clinically also, but with ASOCT, if lens vault is more, and if cataract is also there even little bit, then you can decide of doing cataract surgery. But clear lens extraction, I don't think it's a practice in India to do a clear lens extraction for angle closure glaucoma.
Yes, and especially for I myself had a problem for a hypermetropic eye. Take of a patient of glaucoma, you take up for a very early cataract. You take up the patient, it might land up in some problem, or there can be post-op steroid-related IOPs, peaks, and there can be so many other issues. So I think in India, I mean, I feel it's better to avoid. I mean, and that is the thing. And would anyone want to add anything in this?
I want to add what Dr. Sunita Dubey madam has said. If suppose I have a patient who is on 3 or 4 medication and it's an angle closure disease with an early cataract and it's angle closure glaucoma, I'll probably go for a cataract extraction with a trabeculectomy.
Yeah.
But if it's a very early lens changes and patient is on 3-4 medication, it's a primary open glaucoma, I'll just go for a trabeculectomy. So when you have an angle closure disease, even an early lens cataract, you probably have a lower threshold, what madam was highlighting. There is one condition where I have sometime removed, not clear, but very early cataracts. For example, a patient with acute angle closure, sometimes they have presented very late. For example, I had a patient with acute angle closure with eye pain and head pain who went to and admitted in ICU for his headache, and the patient was done with MRI and treated there, and we came to the eye department almost after 1 month. So by that time that there was complete synechia formation, we couldn't do a PI, there was mild corneal edema also. These type of cases, sometimes a lens extraction has a role in deepening of the anterior chamber. But these patients often will require trabeculectomy later also.
I just have a small doubt regarding the cases which were discussed in like total hyphema following PI. So just one out of interest, I would like to know, like, where was the bleeding from ciliary process injured during the YAG PI, or
No.
these are from the vessels?
Yeah, iris vessels. Iris vessels.
Iris vessels.
Because I saw that thing on there itself, but was not able to manage.
Yeah.
And that time, that day, about 10, 12 years back, that time that thing also did not came to my mind whether he was on this anticoagulants or not.
There is one more suggestion which is actually made, that immediately you can use the argon laser to coagulate the vessel. But in my case, the argon laser machine was in a slightly far away room. So by the time I shifted the patient from this to the other room, I could not actually visualize and coagulate it.
It is really difficult to manage if it starts bleeding that
but
way.
I just don't know how much that works actually, Shahinur, because then nowadays actually we don't even have the argon laser, we have the diode. So I don't know whether
Yes.
the diode would actually, help in that.
Then that frequency doubling ND-YAG also works similar to the argon laser. So we are having that machine in our hospital.
Yeah. For that, actually, they also say that if iris is very thick and there are lots of pigments, you could actually, just thin out that area, wait for half an hour or so, and then again do your puncture, basically, for your PI.
But once it starts bleeding, if the patient is on anticoagulant, nothing helps actually. Even if you press it hard with your lens, it keeps on bleeding.
It doesn't help, even if you're pressing it for half an hour.
Yes, it did not. That was a very interesting case that time, but very difficult to manage.
Okay, Chandrima ma'am, do you if you get a patient of PACG or PACD basically, do you want there are various confusions whether to wait and keep the patient under observation, or do you find it safer to proceed with the PI?
I always proceed with the PI unless the patient is on an anticoagulant. I always proceed with the PI if the what Shahinur described, the scenarios where you need to do a PI. I always proceed with the PI straight away. I do not wait unless, of course, the patient is on an anticoagulant.
Chanda ma'am just said that there was guidelines a few months back. We need to wait. So I am a little bit confused as what others are doing.
No, don't get this mixed up. We are talking of that trial in PACS patients in occludable angles. We are not applying that trial to PAC and PACG patients. No, that is applicable only to PACS patients.
Observation, or what if a patient you feel is not compliant, would not come for observation?
Yes, those are all indications where you need to do it.
You need to do it. And I think
those are the indications, and even if you don't do it, you should sit across the table and counsel the patient that in spite of this, you may have these colored halos and subacute attack, you get back to me. But so we can actually do this across the table with a slightly literate patient and a city patient maybe who will have access to your center. But what you are saying, when you are not sure whether the patient will at all come for follow-up, etc., you should go ahead and do a PI, because you will definitely save those eyes. Maybe later on they come back to you with PACG.
But I think Shahinur, must be doing a lot of more PIs also, because the ethnicity there, we don't get so much of that kind of ethnicity here. But then in the Northeast, you have this people of a particular tribe where they do have very hypermetropic eyes, and you have to actually do a PI without taking a risk, because they probably live in the interiors of Kohima or Mizoram or something like that, so they would never ever come back again. So I'm sure they do a lot of PIs there, even depending on the ethnicity, basically.
Yes.
We have two audience questions. Dr. Shamasri C wants to ask, is there any evidence of corneal endothelial damage post-PI? And how to do PI in a very shallow AC?
Okay, Shainur, you take that, then I'll speak here.
Yes, ma'am. The first question regarding the endothelial damage, there are several publications which say that the damage is usually localized and you don't have a widespread endothelial effect post-PI. And the second question was, how do you proceed?
In a shallow AC.
Shallow AC, I guess, ma'am, there's no other way. I mean, the normal way what we do PI, the same way we have to go for a PI. And maybe one more trick would be not to go too peripheral and maybe do your PI a little more in the mid periphery, in the superotemporal quadrant where the iris could be relatively thin rather than doing a more peripheral PI. Ma'am, would you add something to that?
Yeah, the first thing, Shainur has said it absolutely perfectly. There are studies, and she's rightly said what the studies have said. The second thing I'd just like to add that when you do PI, we have the practice of instilling pilocarpine before we do PI. So however shallow a AC is, when you instill pilocarpine, you do get a little bit of space. And of course, don't go totally peripherally. Try to do it a little bit more towards, not at the center, but mid periphery, basically, which is the chosen site for PI, basically.
At one point is that when we are trying the mid peripheral portion, there is a high chance of injuring the lens. So your energy level should be minimized to start with. There is quite.
I think the beam should be focused properly because the offset is 1.25 posteriorly. So I think it should all 4 points should meet and the beam should exactly focus on the iris. I think that is very important. Sometimes I think people who have not done so many PIs, sometimes there's a tendency, to not focus the beam properly on iris. Sometimes it is anterior, so it can damage the corneal endothelium. But as Shainur said, it is always, even if you have put a spot on corneal endothelium, it is localized, and sometimes it clears up also. So, but one needs to be very, very careful.
In our fellowship, list of a checklist to see, like to check before we used to proceed with PI. So I'll just elaborate a few points. Like first, make sure that the IOP is controlled by giving whatever mannitol, dorsol, whatever is required is give, make the pressures within normal range, and see the patient in the slit lamp to make sure that pilocarpine is fully working, pupil is totally constricted to the minimum possible size, and iris is fully stretched. Then make sure that the patient's head position is all correct, lens position is correct, all the 4 beams are going exactly to the center of your lens, and they're exactly getting localized at one particular point. Search for a crypt and make sure that it's exactly focused on the crypt, like wherever you're getting a good position. And then being fully focused, try to get the patent PI with minimum number of shots. So if we follow the typical textbook description or the procedure for doing PI, in most cases we'll be successful. And as we have already discussed, if it is if we are not able to get a patent PI by say 2, 3, 4 shots, we should just postpone it, let the patient sit for some time and then get back patient again on the machine after say 1 hour or 2 hours once the patient is more comfortable. In the second sitting, it will be much easier than the first one.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi. Dr. Pallavi, would you like to say something, please?
Swati, I have a couple of questions for Dr. Sunita Dubey. Ma'am, there's one Dr. Smita from Chennai. She asks, are NTG patients more prone to vascular occlusions, like retinal vascular occlusions? That's the first question.
Which patient?
NTG patients, normal tension glaucoma patients.
Vascular occlusions?
Retinal vascular occlusions, are they more prone?
Yeah, actually, retinal vascular occlusions are more common with high IOPs. Sometimes we do get patients of angle closure glaucoma who have developed very high IOP, and following which they develop CRVO or branch vein occlusions. So it is associated with high IOPs, not with low IOP.
Okay, thank you. She also asks, is there any role of vasodilator drugs in these normal tension glaucoma cases? There's a tablet CityMet. Is that indicated? Are there any suggestions?
Yeah, actually, vasodilators, as she talked about calcium channel blockers. So calcium channel blocker, apart from lowering the BP, it also causes vasodilatation, and which is not good for the optic nerve head perfusion. So it's a paradoxical effect, and that is why the calcium channel blockers are not given. As far as CityMet is concerned, it is not, I don't think it's a vasodilator. It is a neuroregenerative drug. And studies have shown that it does have some effect on the neuro regeneration or regeneration of the optic nerve. And I myself have used CityMet. I have been using in some patients 500 milligram twice a day for 45 days, and then give a gap of 15 days and then again. So you can repeat up to 3 to 4 cycles, and some patients do get some improvement. So I think, and it doesn't have much side effects, although it's an expensive drug. However, one can try. So CityMet is useful in some patients, as the studies suggest, and I have also seen. I don't know what is the experience of other panelists, but I have seen improvement in some patients.
Thank you. I have another question for Dr. Shahinu. We have Dr. Shayana who's asking, in iris with crypts and thin iris, PI with YAG laser is easy, but PI in eyes post-attack, the iris is thicker and very difficult to do. Are there any tips on how to make it easier? Dr. Shahinu? Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, in the presentation I have mentioned, therefore thicker irides, if it is not possible to get a patent PI with the ND YAG laser, then we can go for a sequential laser with argon followed by an ND YAG laser. That is one option. But post-acute angle closure cases, sometimes the pupil are so dilated and the iris, peripheral iris is so thick. In those cases, I have experienced quite a number of cases where PI has not been possible. And since the IOP was not controlled and patient had significant glaucomatous optic neuropathy, yet or not, does not matter, but we had proceeded for trabeculectomy directly in those cases.
Okay, that makes sense. Dr. Shayana also asked, in phacomorphic cases before doing cataract surgery after controlling IOP medically, should PI be done before the cataract surgery?
I would like to know the opinion of the other experts also, but I personally prefer to do a PI in phacomorphic cataract because I have seen that after the PI, the cataract surgery becomes a little easier than without a PI. So that's my personal experience. I would like to know from others, please.
I'd say a very emphatic yes to that. I always also do a PI because that gives you more space in the anterior chamber to do your phacoemulsification. It's as simple as that, basically.
In my practice, I don't do PI because PI will induce some inflammation, and then you'll have to wait for at least 4, 5 days or 6 days before you take up the patient for. Start with the steroids. Yeah, you're absolutely right that the space is very less, and you judge if there is enough space, then you go ahead, and if there's not enough space, then you can perform PI. Or sometimes you do require, if the AC is almost flat, then you do require some pars plana vitrectomy. So be prepared to do a pars plana vitrectomy and remove some vitreous to make space in the anterior chamber. And ours is a tertiary care institute, and the retina specialist is always available. So it is possible, and you can do that. But in some private practice where the retina specialist is not available, it may be difficult to do a small, to do pars plana vitrectomy. But there is an option to remove some vitreous and create space if the AC is almost flat.
And phacomorphic can be also the preoperative mannitol.
Yeah, I think that is a must.
That's a must.
Yeah, that's a must.
Yeah, and high molecular weight viscoelastics like Hilongerian and all of the use. I think we can even proceed without PI. I mean, I do not, that is my, I mean, I don't know how others do.
But if you use a high molecular weight viscoelastic, you have to be really, really careful that you clean it up well. Otherwise, it's simply going to go and clog the trabecular meshwork and your entire result is actually undone.
Yeah, and as Sunita ma'am said, that I think a lot depends upon case to case also. If we feel that the chamber is having adequate space, we can proceed without a PI. But many a times it is quite shallow, so making a PI makes it more comfortable.
Most of our textbooks, and especially the Western authors, they promote use of PI. But unfortunately, in the cases that I get of phacomorphic, it is practically impossible to do a PI. So most of my cases, like whatever doubts I had regarding PI and whether to go for a combined surgery or cataract surgery in case of phacomorphic. So what I follow is, I do not go for PI. In fact, I would say I dare not to go for PI. And second thing is I go for only cataract surgery. Most of the time I've not done combined surgery. And I've seen that just with the lens removal, they do well.
Yes,
exactly. I have to concur with Dr. Ravi, you know, the pressure should be controlled with pre-op mannitol, like you just said, and the PI is generally not required. The AC also deepens once the IOP reduces, the corneal edema clears up. And neither a PI nor a trabeculectomy is required. Just a cataract extraction is sufficient for such cases.
Dr. Manish, what is
one
your...
point I like to add related to phacomorphic and also sometimes you can't see the disc, so it's difficult to understand whether to do a trap or not, and the pressure is also high. But in case you're not able to see the disc, you're not able to decide about the trap part. Hello.
Manish is having some problem with his net. Have a go now, Manish.
Am I audible?
Yeah, better.
Yeah, sometimes. Can't hear you, Manish. Is it just me?
Hello, Manisha, kindly unmute.
Hello, hello. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, one tip I like to share about phacomorphic, some of these phacomorphic lenses are very dense. You can't see the disc, and if they are presenting late, maybe after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and you're not able to decide whether to do for just a cataract surgery or a combined surgery, then what I do, I plan for a cataract surgery, but I do inform the patient that on table, once you have removed the lens, you can do an indirect ophthalmoscopy and see the disc. Sometimes when you see the disc, you see it's a very advanced glaucoma. So on table, we can even decide whether to do for a trab also. But most of these phacomorphy, you can just do a cataract surgery and get away. Most of these cases will do well just with the cataract surgery.
I had heard of intraday posting cataract surgery, but you're an intraday trap surgeon also, it seems.
You have to tell the patient in advance. You have to be prepared and you tell the patient in advance. Like for example, you have a hypermature cataract with a 35 pressure. You can't see the disc. Ultrasound may be inconclusive. Once you remove the cataract, you see it's a total cupping. So you can tell the patient in advance, and based on what we see after removing the lens, we can consider doing a trabeculectomy.
Great. Okay. So I think we can move on. Are there any more questions, Dr. Tulikamadi?
Yes, there's a couple of questions from Dr. Shayana again for any of our experts. There is a lot of iridocorneal touch in some phacomorphic cases. The juniors fear causing decimate membrane detachment if PI is attempted. And also how do juniors assess the ideal size of PI? When do they know it's adequate?
This is 150 microns, if as the literature mentions. So even a small PI is also adequate. That is being mentioned.
Practically, a tiniest hole can drain the entire container. So the moment you get the aqueous trickling out, you're fine. Absolutely. That's it.
Thank you.
Now proceed with our next talk and then go for the questions. Yes.
I think so. You're getting there.
So next I would be presenting. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Swati.
I
think you need to go back to the initial slide.
Yeah, I'll do that. Yes, so a case of spikes and remissions. So this was a 43-year-old female who presented with dimness of vision in both the eyes and a recurrent redness and pain in right eye for 10 months. And she had a history of colored halos in right eye, which had become more frequent nowadays. There was no history of hypertension, diabetes, ocular trauma, surgery, cough or fever, no arthritis, asthma, allergy, migraine, skin eruptions or peptic ulcer disease or any other systemic illnesses. There was no history of drug intake. So she was a hypermetropic and her uncorrected visual acuity was 6/60 and the best corrected was 6/9 part. The IOP at presentation on applanation was 54 in the right eye and 20 in the left eye. So on anterior segment examination, the right eye, there was no conjunctival congestion. The cornea was almost clear at 54 IOP. It was mild haze though, but there were fine KPs on the endothelium. The cells were just 1+. And no heterochromia, no atrophy. The lens was clear. The other eye was absolutely fine. On gonioscopy, the posterior trabecular meshwork was visible on most all the quadrants, and there was a little pass in the temporal quadrant. No new neovascularization was detected. The other eye was scleral spur in all the quadrants. So this was this picture. And let me elaborate. The right eye, the VCDR was 0.9, only the peripheral rim was remaining. The temporal PPCRA was present and no parapapillary disc hemorrhage. The nerve fiber layer defects were present, macula was healthy, and fundus was within normal limit, as we can see here. The left eye was normal, VCDR 0.4. So with the 54 RP and cells 1+, the patient was prescribed tab acetazolamide, prednisolone eye drop in the right eye, and a combination drop of brimonidine and timolol in the right eye. So the first day, the IOP in the right eye reduced to 42 and 8 in the left eye. Day 2, the IOP was 20 in the right eye and 10 in the left eye. The cornea was clear, the disc macula and rest of the things were the same. The cells were still 1+. The patient the patient was complaining of tingling, so acetazolamide had to be stopped. Day 5, the IOP in the eyes was 14 and 12 in right eye, left eye respectively. The cells were still 1+, and the fluorometholone was added instead of prednisolone, and the brimonidine timolol combination was continued. The rest of the glaucoma workup was now done. So the right eye, the pachymetry showed 544 micron thickness and left eye was 540. And these were the field changes in the right eye. And this was the left eye. This was the OCT in the right eye and in the left eye. So as we can see, there was a thinning, RNFL thinning in the right eye. And the patient was kept on frequent follow-ups initially every few days, then weekly. Then fluorometholone was gradually tapered off. But after 2 months, the patient returned with a similar picture with an IOP of 46 on brimonidine and timolol this time. And the right eye, there was corneal edema, cells and flare was 2+, AC was deep, and fine KPs were there. So patient was now again given topical steroids, oral acetazolamide, brinzolamide was added in addition to the brimonidine timolol combination. but recurrent such spikes and remissions were seen over the following months with the interspike IOP in right eye around 20 millimeter on MMT, maximum medical therapy. So to summarize, I can say that it was a middle-aged female with recurrent unilateral IOP spikes associated with minimum AC reaction, open angles, and a VCDR of 0.9. So what can our differentials be? It wasn't angle closure because the angles were open and there was no idocyclitis, and the reaction was not huge. It was very mild reaction. So it wasn't even uveitic. So this was more like a Poshner-Schlossman syndrome or a glaucomatocyclitic crisis. Investigations were done to find out cause for any uveitis, any systemic causes, but results were not significant. So what next? Should we go for an AC tap with PCR analysis for CMV, herpes simplex, or herpes zoster virus? Or should we just prescribe some long-term oral and topical antivirals, or to go for trap with MMC right eye, underguarded visual prognosis, or should we go for a shunt surgery? Thank you. I would like the opinion of the House regarding this.
I think Posner-Schlossman syndrome, as you said rightly, I think should be the diagnosis of this particular patient. It's more common in males, although I think the patient was a female, and it's unilateral, and it occurs in third to fourth decade. It starts occurring third to fourth decades, and you do get the remissions and spikes of IOP, and it is associated with minimal uveitis. So you will not see a very severe reaction in the anterior chamber, and there are fine KPs and very high IOP. It is basically because of the trabeculitis. So as rightly said, a course of steroid with anti-glaucoma treatment is what is required. And in most of the cases, the occurrence of episodes of high pressures is not very frequent. So sometimes it happens, once in 3-4 months or 6 months. But in your case, it happened, I think, after 2 months. And the CD ratio also, I think, advanced to 0.9 cupping and, very advanced damage. So one needs to be very careful. And in India, I think compliance is the issue. And if the patient doesn't come for follow-up, I think it's a good idea to do trap in such cases if attacks of high IOP and uveitis, and keep a very stringent follow-up of such patients. And, I would continue anti-glaucoma, especially when their optic nerve is so much damaged that you have to continue with the anti-glaucoma treatment, or you can resort to surgery. But in some patients, the damage is not so much. So you can just educate the patient about the occurrence of attacks. And because whenever attack is there, the patient will complain of blurring of vision because it is associated with some uveitis. So blurring of vision, an intelligent patient will appreciate blurring of vision. So you have to educate the patient and keep start steroids and anti-glaucoma treatment during attacks. But if it is a very advanced stage, then you have to continue with the medical management, or you can resort to surgery, filtering surgery. I will not go for tube as a primary procedure in such patients.
Swati, one point I like to ask you: do you have a perimetry report of this patient?
Yeah, I have. That's shown there.
Because the OCT actually was very much borderline compared to the advanced disc cupping which showed. OCT was actually pretty normal.
Yeah, since Manish is mentioning that, I'd like to say the OCT was a Stratus OCT, and it was the video image that you saw there was not right because it was not concentric around the 3.4 millimeter diameter. So the OCT actually has to be left out for this.
And as I think one point I'll add to what Dr. Sunita Dubey Madam was mentioning, definitely close follow-up is very important in these patients, and we do need to inform the patient that whenever you have any blurring or any halos, they should immediately report. And all these acute spikes should be managed very aggressively, including with Diamox. And last resort, I think, will be to go for trabeculectomy when you see a possible definite progression. But you can share the perimetry report in case you have it.
Yeah, I had shown that. I'll reshare it. So would antivirals, topical or oral, help in this? Or should we go for a PCR? Or straight away we should go for a TRAB?
Can I add one point?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Yeah, basically, I have similar cases. I remember two cases. One was an elderly lady, another was also a lady, but around 40 to 42 years. So let me talk first about the elderly lady. Initially, that lady had a long-term back. She was aphakic. So aphakic, you know that they have not having that crispy vision, but still she used to come and complain of bloody vision whenever she was getting the attack. And the pressure was very typical of that thing with clear cornea and clear AC almost. So basically what Dr. Sunita said, it's a trabeculitis which actually plays a role in these situations. So I do not know much about the antiviral efficacy, antiviral therapy efficacy, but steroid works wonder. So topical steroid, if you have to give and give systemic acetazolamide, taper it off. This patient had a frequent similar attack with progression of the field. And I did the trabeculectomy, and after that, the progression was halted. So another patient who was, yeah, hello?
No problem, go ahead.
Yeah, another patient who was around 40, 42 years, that also about 10 years back. She was just presbyope, and she also complained of the same thing, on and off blurring of the vision. And she came to me in an advanced stage only. That time the visual field loss was very alarming, and I just waited for some times, but that patient actually lost the follow-up, and after that I do not know much about this patient. But that was a typical case of Posner-Schlossman with a clear cornea and open angles with minimum AC reactions, and that's very typical of Posner-Schlossman, unilateral.
But if there is a suspicion of viral etiology, sometimes they present like this. Like there was a case that Dr. Basak had sent me, and in the beginning I thought it was Posner-Schlossman. And then later on, he got a PCR done and it came out to be CMV. And the patient was then specifically treated against CMV also, and the patient was doing well. So if there is a suspicion, because one of the differentials would be a uveitic viral uveitic glaucoma. So if there is a suspicion and if one does have access to PCR, then it can be done in some cases.
Suchanda, it's only the antiviral you give or along with that steroid also? Because there is a trabeculitis associated. Hello?
I cannot hear.
Am I audible? Yeah. Did you get my question, Suchanda? Suchanda?
Yeah, and now I've got back. I was not. I couldn't hear anything.
Actually, my question is,
was I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. My question is that did you start only antiviral or along with that topical steroids also?
No. The patient was like on steroids and all that, and then I think some of the started the CMV medications. I don't remember the exact dosing now, but I remember that the diagnosis had come out to be CMV positive.
Main cause of high IOP is your trabeculitis, and that need to be. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Yeah. So
my net is giving problem.
Actually, trabeculitis is the main cause, so you have to give intense topical steroid for these cases.
So I'll just share something.
Yes, ma'am, please.
So I would go with Posner-Schlossman for this, but then I would not leave uveitic glaucoma behind, because there was a case, and she happened to be the sister of my classmate, ENT surgeon, and she had uveitic glaucoma, and we looked at everything and nothing could be found. And, ultimately when we did all the tests, we found that she had some autoimmune disorder, and nothing actually helped. She had to be started on methotrexate. And that is when actually the uveitis came down, and as the uveitis came down, the secondary glaucoma also came down. So these are cases which come once maybe in a while, but we actually cannot rule them out because
Yes.
they have to be kept in mind. We just can't. I thought initially Posner Scholzmann, but I was completely wrong.
Yes.
It was
Excluded.
Yes, totally different.
That is, I think, uveitis in a white eye.
Yes, absolutely. Not really white eye. She did complain of blurring of vision, and she did have a little amount of ciliary congestion. It was very confusing, and she had these recurrent attacks. Finally, we got everything done, top to bottom, and that's when we found out that she had this autoimmune disorder. And
so actually, intermediate uveitis, sometimes there is some spillage in the anterior chamber. So actually, reaction in the anterior chamber is not that dense.
Yeah, but
thing lies intermediate.
Yeah, but having said that, is that however much of steroid you give or viral or whatever, unless you actually get to the root cause, you cannot actually control it. It was like magic after she started methotrexate.
Yes, ma'am. That is why I left my last slide as what we should do. Either we should do a PCR or a antiviral prophylactically, or
get all the tests done, everything under the sun.
Yeah. So I think, are there any other questions, Dr. Tulika Di?
No, that's all for now.
Okay. Does any of the panelists would like to add anything or discuss or share?
I think one differentiating point between Posner Scholzmann and uveitis is that with recurrent uveitic attack, I think gonioscopy, we were stressing a lot on gonioscopy. The gonioscopy will show a lot of PAS in case of uveitis, if it's a recurrent uveitis. So I think that could be one of the differentiating points.
Yes, ma'am.
Postgraduates.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So this case just had a temporal pass, PSS.
Yeah, so rest of the angle was open in this particular patient.
Open angles were totally open, and there was always a minimal amount of cells, 1+ or rarely 2+, and yeah. So I think we can call that a day. It was a great evening. I'll hand over now the session now to Dr. Tulika for the vote of thanks. Dr. Tulika Di, please.
Thank you.
And Dr. Tulika is our dear Didi who has been in ophthalmology in India, always beside us, and always, to reach out of a phone call or a hand, she's always there. So please go ahead.
Thank you for your kind words. Good evening. Although we are constantly battling against glaucoma, the silent thief of sight, March is the month for glaucoma awareness. Surfing the glaucoma wave is the OphthaEVA effort leading up to the Glaucoma Week, which begins on Sunday, the 7th of March. Special thanks go out to our generous sponsors, Ajanta Pharma Limited, especially Mr. Brijesh Gupta, Group Product Manager, Annex Division, Mr. Satyajit Nag and their technical team. I request Mr. Brijesh to say a few words now.
Thank you, Dr. Tulika. Today is a very auspicious day, Doctor. We all know that today is a Sarojini Naidu's Memorial Day, and we all know that what contributions he has given to the society. At the same time, we also appreciate your contribution. You inspire as doctor. So today also you make the day memorial for us. On the outside, I would like to thank Dr. Tulika, Dr. Chandrima Paul, Dr. Shahinur, Dr. Swati, Dr. Suchanda, Dr. Maitreya Das, Dr. Sunita, and Dr. Kumar Ravi, and Manish Singh. And the list is much more bigger. So I'd like to apologize those who have not named them. At the same time, we from Ajanta Pharma don't want to lose the opportunity that we would like to serve all your patients through whatever new therapy we can bring in the market, and the latest therapy, which we all know, that is Rho kinase inhibitors, which were introduced recently. And I would like to thank to all the faculty as well as to all the doctors that Ripatech has touched almost 1 lakh unit in the span of just 8 to 9 months, even in this COVID era. So thank you very much. At the same time, the confidence of yours has developed as an adjuvant therapy, even in corneal dystrophy. And a few of you doctors have shared the confidence as a monotherapy also. So thank you very much for making Ripatech as the #1 brand in glaucoma, as the fastest growing brand in glaucoma. And we would like to share all your success stories with all of you. And at the same time, I would like to request to you that whenever my field people come to you, just share your suggestions, which are very much important for all of us, which matters for all of us. Thank you very much for make our day. Thank you very much from Ajanta Pharma and team Ajanta from field as well as head office.
Thank you, Mr. Brajesh. I am grateful to our guest faculty for opening our eyes to glaucoma and its challenges. A very special thank you, especially to both our national EVAs, Dr. Sunita Dubey and Dr. Shaheen Uttayab, for sparing time from their busy schedules. Also, thank you to our EVA chair and my EVA co-host. Thank you very much to our very knowledgeable panel of the experts, speakers, and our compare, the always dynamic spearhead, Dr. Swati Agarwal. Thank you to all the doctors for joining us today. Unfortunately, Dr. Anuradha Chandra could not be with us today due to a personal medical emergency. We wish her all a speedy recovery and will keep her in our thoughts and prayers. We sincerely hope that you all enjoyed tonight's educational offering as much as we have enjoyed hosting it for you. Before we end tonight, I would like to inform you that our next meeting will hopefully be a hybrid one. We will keep you posted. Thank you, everyone. Please take care and stay safe. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Good night. Good night to you all.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you very much. Good night. Good night.
Good night and thank you.